Did you catch those closing verses that Paul told us? As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept this matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead could mean. They didn't have a clue of what happened up there on the mountain. And actually, they missed a couple of major clues: the presence of Moses, the presence of Elijah, the symbols of law and prophets. But they missed it. They just didn't get it. Our question, though, is, do we? Do we get it? Jesus had lots and lots of followers. Think back to the gospel stories you've heard, and we know of at least one time when Jesus had 5,000 people present. Why? What was Jesus doing that 5,000 people would bother to show up? Well, maybe some had heard from time to time, if you follow Jesus, you can get a free lunch. Or at other times, Jesus was known to cure people of their sickness and ailments. And of course, it's always fun to just hang out with the crowd. Jesus had started with a much smaller, more select group. We know them as the 12 disciples. And in today's gospel lesson, Jesus narrows it even further to an in-group of just 3 guys: Peter, James, and John. And only this small select group get to make that trip to the mountaintop. And while they were there, he was transfigured before them, whatever that may mean. Transfigured, a word with 2 distinct parts: trans and figure. Well, when someone or something is transed, it just means that their earlier condition or status has been changed. Think back, it hasn't been all that long when some of you were transferred from junior high to senior high. A change in status. Or you can transport something from Seguin to San Antonio and have a change in location. Figuration, the word is pretty obviously refers to shape or appearance of things. Now I want us to all say together the word transfiguration. That is the first and only time you will say it this year, unless you are in Dr. Beck's New Testament class. So up on that mountaintop, Jesus was changed and he looked different. We ask, how did that happen? We don't know. The gospel lesson doesn't tell us. Well then, why did it happen? Why was the change? Well, somehow and some way it was intended to help those 3 disciples to accept and to understand that Jesus would die and he would be resurrected. So did it help them understand? No, they still didn't get it. But in typical take charge fashion, Peter jumps right in the middle of this and tries to take over. Peter wants control. Peter tries to take over by suggesting that we build 3 booths, or 3 tabernacles, or 3 permanent places. One for you, Jesus, and one for Elijah, and one for Moses. That way, whenever Peter or the others want to recreate this mountaintop experience, all they would need to do would be to go back up the mountain to these permanent structures. And there would be no change. Yes, Peter tried to take control, but God had other plans. God steps in and says, in effect, shut up and listen. It's an interesting thing for God to do if you think about it. If you look back over your New Testament experience to that, we'll find that very, very rarely in the New Testament do we find God speaking. Now, in the Old Testament, God speaks all over the place. He talks to Abraham, God talks with Moses, He talks to Samuel and Isaiah and all of the other prophets. In the Old Testament, God is very active and very involved, but not so in the New Testament. Only twice do we read of God speaking directly. Once at Jesus' baptism, and then again at this transfiguration event. But both times, God's comments are somewhat similar. The first thing He does in both occasions is to identify Jesus. This is my Son. He says it at the baptism, and again, as we heard, at the transfiguration. At the baptism, God goes on and says, I'm pleased with Him. We might paraphrase that to say, I bless Him. I support what He's doing. But in today's transfiguration story, the second part of the message is, listen to my Son. Pay attention to what He's trying to tell you. And that brings us full circle, back to the opening statement and the question of my sermon. The disciples didn't get it, but do we? Have we listened closely? Have we paid attention, not to this sermon and not to me, but have we paid attention and listened to God? What are the lessons that we need to take away from this transfiguration story? Well, first I would suggest that our primary task is the task to listen. God is God. We are not. Which is the second point of don't become a Peter. Don't try to take control. We can't and we have no business trying to script and program God. That's not at all what discipleship is about. And third, we are to learn to live openly, to live with a sense of awe, a sense of wonder, to live with a sense of expectation. For when we find ourselves in unusual places and experience unusual events, and sooner or later we all will, when we find ourselves in that kind of a setting, we are to pause and listen and ask ourselves, where is God in all this?